right, we are just banging these out consistently lately. That's 3 weeks in a row. Today we've got one from Shawn who says, I was wondering if you could talk a little in one of your Q&A videos about the gap in weight between the snatch and clean and jerk. I'm only about a year into training specifically for weightlifting. I'm a master's athlete. My current numbers are best snatch 72 and best clean and jerk 113 kilos, which is a 41 gap between. It's frustrating because I know I'm strong enough to put the weight overhead, but technically trying to close this gap. Thanks. First of all, Shawn, you kind of answered your own question, right? You just said you're strong enough, but you're technically lacking, right? So there's your first giant clue. You need to work on your snatch technique. Now, having said that, I'll get into more detail for the rest of you, and maybe, Shawn, you're still interested in what I have to say, but the number of kilos difference is kind of meaningless because what matters is the percentage, right? The relation. 41 kilos at heavier weights might be a very small gap, but at your weights, it's a really big gap. So my rule of thumb is you're looking at, snatch should be about 78 to 83% of your clean and jerk. So for you, you're at 64% right now. So clearly way below, as you recognized, where you should be. So you'd be looking 78 to 83% of 113 is 88 to 94 kilos. So that is, if all things were balanced, all things being equal, that's about what you should be snatching. So let's say 90 kilos. And now you can say, okay, well, I'm not technically good at the snatch. And that may be true, but that's also kind of a real vague thing. And so how do you address that, right? How do you just say, I'm going to get my technique better? You need to be more specific than that. So just to go over this, a few reasons why that snatch might fall considerably below the relative level you'd expect. And this can be stuff that you can't correct, right? If you're very short-limbed, short legs, short arms, long torso, you're going to tend to clean and jerk relatively more than you snatch, based on your strength level. If your mobility is really bad, that's usually going to have far less of an effect on the clean and jerk than on the snatch, right? In the snatch, you really need to have pretty solid mobility in that low or the receiving position. To be able to be balanced, to be able to get in low enough to get into those heavy weights and to get a really solid, reliable overhead position that is going to be stable, right, and locked out. If you can't lock your elbows out, for example, you may be able to get the bar overhead but not keep it there. And along those lines, if anatomically you're not able to straighten your elbows completely, that's certainly going to play into your ability or inability to make those heavier snatches, and it will have a bit less of an effect on the jerk because your arms are closer to vertical, which is a stronger position structurally, and also the wider your arms are. So if you're going from here, the jerk close to vertical, out to the snatch at a considerably wider angle, all engineers and mathematicians know this vector force issue where, let's say you've got 100 kilos overhead and your arms are perfectly vertical. Each arm is holding 50 kilos, right? That's the amount of force it has to resist. The wider you go, the more each arm has to support. So now each of these arms with that same 100 kilos overhead is actually resisting more than 50 kilos of force. Okay, so that's why that one reason why that ability to lock your elbows makes more of a difference in the snatch versus the jerk. If you have, let's say you're relatively short for your body weight, you're going to tend to have a stronger clean and jerk than a snatch, right? That's just a body type thing, right? Just like real tall, skinny guys and gals tend to be much better at snatching relative to clean and jerk. And then finally, if you are kind of you're a strong person, but you're not necessarily explosive, you're going to tend to excel more at the clean and jerk than in the snatch, and that should be fairly obvious, right? It definitely requires a lot more acceleration to get under a heavy snatch than to get under a heavier clean and even a jerk, especially if you're one of these short-limbed folks, right? If you don't even have to move the bar that far. So of course, the anatomical stuff, you're not going to change that. The body weight stuff, you can potentially change to some degree. you're not going to grow any taller. So if you do have some wiggle room, with the weight class, you can kind of consider playing with that to adjust your competitiveness. But main thing I would focus on is figuring out why exactly your snatch is lacking so much. So first thing, again, to look at is mobility. Do you have the mobility to sit into a really strong, stable, consistent overhead squat? Next, can you get into that bottom position really aggressively and dynamically with a snatch balance, or are you kind of slow and hesitant? So start building that end of things and give yourself a really big margin of overhead strength. So get your overhead squat up, get your snatch push presses up, and get your snatch balances up well beyond what you want to snatch. So let's say we're talking about a 90 kilo snatch. Get your overhead squat up to 110 plus. Get your snatch balance up to at least 100 plus. And you should be able to bang out sets of 5 snatch push presses with 75 to 80% of your best snatch or so. And then as far as the technique goes, I can't tell you what the issue is. I've never seen you lift. I'm not ever going to see you lift. So you need to go through all of the millions of free articles and videos on my website. Maybe look at other people's stuff, but you don't really have to. And try to break down where things are going wrong, right? Or do you tend to be out of balance, either too far forward in your pull or shifting too far back to your heels in your pull? Do you tend to initiate your second pull too early so the bar is hitting low on your thigh and getting kicked away? Do you hesitate at the top of the pull and lose a lot of that momentum that you've created, so you don't have the opportunity, the time and the space to get under the bar in time? Do you not know how to pull under? In other words, do you just pull as hard as you can and then fall down under the bar and hope it all works out? Or are you, really actively, properly pulling yourself under the bar and punching up underneath it? So again, there are so many possibilities on what technically could be going wrong, and very likely it's more than one thing. It's probably a whole collection of things, some of which are kind of the results of previous problems. So again, follow the rule, the first and the worst, right? Start with the errors that are occurring earlier in the lift and that are more important. Correct those first, because in a lot of cases, those are going to correct the later kind of more minor problems all by themselves. If you start the other direction, you're probably not going to be able to fix these small things because they're happening as a result of the other big things. I think that pretty much covers it. So dial that in, take some video, compare it to what you're looking at, more advanced successful athletes do, and then use that and, go in there and chip away at what those issues are. And there's no reason, you may always be someone who clean and jerks relatively more than you snatch. Relative to your strength, not to each other, of course, more than you snatch, but you should not have that big of a gap. There is definitely something suspicious going on, and I believe you can figure it out.
Greg Everett with Catalyst Athletics here. Please subscribe, like, and share this video. If you have questions, post them in the comments. I answer all of them. Also check out catalystathletics.com for the biggest Olympic weightlifting exercise library out there, along with hundreds of free articles and videos and other resources for both athletes and coaches.